Chapter 8 The Enchanted. Time crawled by at a snail's pace to Tika, every second stretching on and on. She sat idle in her chair, staring at the still slumbering Avaline. Bradigen sat beside her, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes downcast, his lips pulled into an uncomfortable grimace. All was silent, save for the occasional, muffled rumble of activity in the city outside. But in spite of that silence, Tika was anything but peaceful. Her thoughts were spiraling rampantly out of control, leaving her locked into her seat in a silent, soul-snaring panic. Avaline was enchanted. The runes were covered up now, Tika having replaced the bandages, but she had not imagined them, try as she might to convince herself that she had. Her stomach twisted and turned every so often, and she couldn't help but imagine what tool had been used to carve the poor girl's arm open. A knife or an awl, most likely. That must have been what caused Avaline's sudden panic attack. She had seen a tool like the one that had carved open her skin. She had been begging for it to stop, for someone to get away. She shuddered in sympathetic disgust.
Who could even think of doing something so cruel? It's not right,
she thought. In her mind's eye, she saw Avaline strapped to a cold stone table in a darkened room. An ominous figure loomed over her, a scythe blade of a grin visible in the black, and a knife held tight in their hand. And she still didn't even know what the enchantment did. Tika could read the runes, but in her shock, she'd barely been able to think, much less translate the language. She knew that there had been 3 full lines of text, so the enchantment must have done something fairly elaborate. She had no clue what it could be, though. She had never seen anything strange or out of the ordinary in all of the interactions she had had with Avaline thus far. No supernatural abilities, no sharpened senses. As smart as she was, she didn't seem to have enhanced intelligence, and Tika was not about to unravel the bandages again to get another look. What if Avaline woke up when she was looking? Tika groaned, covering her face with her hands.
What are we gonna do?
She whimpered quietly. Legally speaking, she should have run and told law enforcement the moment she found out Avaline was enchanted. They would escort her to the assemblage, the magi there would conduct tests and ask questions to find out the nature of the enchantment and who was responsible for giving it to her. Then, if the enchantment was benign, they might allow her to keep it. Most likely, though, they would simply remove the ringstone dust or deprive her of the ringstone that powered the enchantment. After that, she would most likely be released. Tika clacked her beak.
But that's all assuming that she was enchanted against her will. If she let it happen willingly.
Tika shook her head. She didn't want to imagine that scenario. Anyone who submitted themselves willfully to flesh enchantment were criminals. And during her panic attack, Avaline had at one point said, "I changed my mind." Tika shook her head vehemently.
No, Avaline wouldn't do that. She's a good person. She wouldn't let someone violate her body like this. Would she?
Inwardly, Tika scolded herself, recalling that she didn't actually know Avaline all that well. She'd only known her for a little over a week. That was barely any time to get a bead on someone's true nature, even for a Kraven. Was it possible that, for all this time, she'd been crooning and swooning over a criminal? She didn't want to even entertain the notion, but neither could she ignore it. "Tika, calm down," Bradigen said beside her, his hand falling gently on her back. "Panicking isn't going to help anyone. Take a breath." Tika did as she was told, sucking in a long, deep breath, then letting it out in a whistling sigh. If nothing else, she was glad that Bradigen had agreed to stay here and take care of Avaline first before he did anything else. He'd been just as shocked as Tika when she told him what she had seen under the bandages, but unlike Tika, he had the presence of mind to stay focused. Tika heard a rustling. Her heart skipped a beat. Looking up, she saw Avaline slowly sitting up in the bed. The human girl's face was twisted with confusion, her eyes darting this way and that. She looked around for a few seconds, her eyes eventually settling on Tika and Bradigen. She blinked.
Tika? Bradigen? What happened?
She asked, her voice half slurred in her still groggy state. Tika swallowed the lump in her throat.
You passed out,
she stammered.
You fell on the floor. You were holding your arm and crying, and you looked like you were in pain.
Avaline's eyes widened, and her right hand flashed up to slip under her left sleeve. Tika's blood chilled as Avaline's fingers ran over the fresh bandages, feeling them over. Avaline took in a sharp, fearful breath. Her eyes shifted between Bradigen and Tika, wide and frantic. Once again, the color drained from her face.
You saw...
She choked out fearfully. Tika opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came. A moment later, Bradigen answered. You're enchanted. Avaline's hand fell from her arm, and the sleeve concealed the bandages again. She jerked her body to hide her left side and scooted back along the bed until she hit the wall. Tika's heart broke in her chest when she saw how Avaline was staring at her. This wasn't the friendly face she had become so enchanted by. This was raw, primal fear, and all of it was directed at Tika. She lifted her hands.
Ava,
she began weakly.
No.
Avaline mumbled, her breath coming in faster, panicking gasps.
No. You weren't supposed to.
Avaline, look at me, Bradigen said, his voice firm. Avaline's gaze snapped to him, focused and terrified. Bradigen rose slowly from his seat, took a step forward, and knelt down beside the bed. Take a breath. Relax. It's okay. You're safe. We haven't told anyone yet. We want to hear the story from you before we do anything. Avaline listened to him, but she didn't say anything. Finally, she let her face fall, hiding her eyes behind a curtain of hair. There was a long, tense silence.
You saw...
Avaline repeated in a choked half whisper. It was not a question. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Avaline lifted her face just enough for one eye to poke out from behind her hair, and broke that silence.
You weren't supposed to see this.
Her tone was calmer now. She was still shaking, but her initial panic had faded. Tika took that as a good sign. She carefully stood and moved to stand beside Bradigen.
Why didn't you ever say anything?
She asked carefully.
We could have helped you, Ava.
Avaline shook her head.
You would have turned me in,
she said curtly. Tika flinched back, stunned. There was a bitterness in the woman's voice she had yet to hear, and it sent her skin crawling with dread. Avaline lifted her eyes to stare at them.
You would have sent me to the assemblage.
Tika leaned back, surprised and confused.
Well, yeah? Maybe, you've been enchanted, Avaline!
She stressed.
That's illegal, immoral, profane.
Avaline snapped, and Tika cowered back, falling into her seat. Bradigen held up his hands. Hey, easy. We're not here for an argument, Avaline. We just want to understand what we're looking at, he said in a soothing tone. A moment passed, and Avaline let out a long and heavy sigh. She slumped in place, her head drooping again.
I'm sorry,
she murmured quietly. Her hand returned to her enchanted arm, clutching at it tightly through her sleeve.
I always knew someone was going to find out. I just didn't...
She trailed off, slowly shaking her head. When she spoke again, her voice was one of resignation.
What are you going to do?
Tika and Bradigen shared a look. The latter could only offer a helpless shrug. I don't know, he said. Tika nodded in agreement, feeling like a rat caught in a cage with a hungry Rythar. Legally, she knew what they were supposed to do, but she wanted to know the full story first. She needed to hear it. After a few seconds, Tika stood up again, hoping to all of the gods that it was permissible, and settled down on her knees by the bedside. She reached out for Avaline, but thought better of it a moment later. So instead, she merely settled for asking the question on everyone's mind.
How did this happen to you? Who did this?
Avaline did not lift her head. She did not say a word.
Have they already been caught? Please tell me they've already been caught.
Tika pressed, hoping with all of her heart that the monster that mutilated Avaline like this had paid the price. Avaline shook her head.
No, I don't think so,
she said, her voice a dull monotone.
They fled the city years ago. I don't know where they went.
Tika felt a twinge of frustration. The thought that this person, whoever they were, might still be out there somewhere, able to ply their craft. She shook her head to dispel the notion before it could get the better of her. She frowned as part of what Avaline said fully registered.
Years ago? How long ago was this? Around 8, maybe 9 years ago. I was only 10.
Avaline replied quietly. Tika gasped.
You've suffered this enchantment for that long?
She asked, mortified.
Oh my gods, that's awful.
Avaline visibly tensed, but she said nothing. Bradigen stroked curiously at his beard. Avaline, tell me, why didn't you go to the assemblage yourself after you were enchanted? He asked. Not wanting someone else to turn you in, I can understand that. It'd shine all kinds of suspicions on you from the more overzealous magi, but not going in to seek treatment on your own? Avaline did not answer right away. After a few seconds, she slowly shook her head.
I can't go to the assemblage, you two.
Tika hesitated. She leaned back slightly, her eyes lingering on the enchanted limb.
But why not?
She questioned, trying and failing to understand.
The Magi there are supposed to help victims of flesh enchantments. You didn't have to bear this. I'm not a victim!
Avaline shouted, cutting Tika off and plunging the room into another heavy silence. No one dared to move or even speak for several long seconds as the undeniable implication of Avaline's shout settled over them. Tika's tongue felt fat and unwieldy in her beak as she tried to say something. All that came out was a strangled, withering whistle. Avaline lifted her head to show her face again. Her eyes were red, puffy, and glistening. Her lips had contorted with emotion.
I'm not a victim,
Avaline repeated, quieter this time.
I sought this enchantment out myself. It was my idea.
Tika's heart twisted in her chest. She stood up involuntarily, a chill running down her spine. She staggered back from the bedside, feeling her stomach twisting in her belly. Her back met the wall with a thump.
But why?
She rasped out. She clacked her beak, and before she even knew it, her voice was rising.
Why would you do that to yourself?
Avaline closed her mouth and looked down at her arm. She lifted her hand to touch the bandages again.
I didn't have a choice, Tika,
she said, her voice low and solemn.
There's always a choice, Avaline. No. Not this time there wasn't. But it's flesh enchantment!
Tika protested, finally finding the strength to push away from the wall. Tika, Bradigen said in warning, lifting a hand, but Tika was already speaking.
It's forbidden! And for damn good reason! I saw your arm, Ava. It was mutilated! What in the world could be so important that you'd let someone destroy your body like that? It's not right!
It was like a candle being snuffed out. The look on Avaline's face morphed from solemn resignation to furious defiance in a heartbeat. It was a look Tika had never even imagined Avaline could have. And under that hellfire glare, Tika could only shrink back, afraid, realizing too late that she had just made a mistake she could not take back.
You know what? Maybe you're right,
Avaline growled, standing up from the bed. Tika backed up. Avaline cut her off.
My body is mutilated. But you know what? It's my body, Tika. Mine. It belongs to me. Not you. Not the man who enchanted it, not Bradigen, and not the Magi of the assemblage. And nobody has the right to tell me what I can do with my body.
Avaline, please, Bradigen said quietly, lifting his hands. Calm down. Avaline cut him off with another harsh glare before he could say anything else. She turned back to Tika, her eyes glistening with tears. Tika stared back at her. She choked out, her mind spiraling.
I'm sorry.
Avaline stared at her for a few more seconds. Her expression softened somewhat, and she worked her jaw up and down, as if she were searching for something to say. Nothing came, though. In the end, Avaline shook her head. She gripped her arm again. Without a word, she spun on her heels and stormed for the door, the floor shuddering beneath her every step. The door slammed shut behind her with an echoing crash, leaving Tika and Bradigen alone. Tika, petrified with emotions, could hear the thumps of Avaline's agitated steps echoing into the distance, before finally falling silent. Tika didn't move. She barely dared to breathe. Her guts tied themselves into painful knots, and her heart shriveled in her chest. There was a lingering afterimage of Avaline's face glaring down at her, an image imprinted in her mind behind her eyelids.
Oh, gods.
Tika choked out as a familiar tightness took root in her throat. She hugged herself and crumpled to the floor, back against the wall and knees to her chest.
Oh, gods, what have I done?
Avaline's words echoed in her mind over and over again. They had hit her like a tsunami when she had heard them, but now they buried her like an avalanche. There had been so much anger in Avaline's voice, but so much fear, too. And why shouldn't she be scared? Her secret was exposed. At any time, Tika or Bradigen could go to the assemblage and Avaline would be pulled off the street. Her freedom, maybe even her very life, were in someone else's hands. And Tika had just shown she was unworthy to hold either. Guilt and shame swelled in her mind. How could she have said those things? She'd seen Avaline dive headfirst into the waters of Archshade without even a moment of hesitation to save 3 drowning children. She had put herself at risk without any promise of a reward. She didn't even ask for one. All she had asked for was that the children be more careful. Enchanted or not, it took a very special sort of kindness and courage to do that. Tika had been friends with that. And now, thanks to her big, stupid mouth, she had lost it. As the realization of just how badly she'd screwed up washed over her, Tika did the only thing she could think to do. She buried her face into her knees and started crying. The tears came hot and freely. When mingled with her own self-deprecating thoughts, she didn't notice Bradigen approaching her until she felt 2 warm, thick, familiar hands on her shoulders, drawing her into a tender hug. Bradigen knelt before her, his face the picture of concern. "Oh, Tika," he whispered to her, stroking the back of her head and quietly shushing her. Tika opened her beak to say something, but only more sobs came out. She went limp in the old dwarf's embrace, taking what comfort she could from his warmth. He held her tight, slowly rocking her back and forth as a parent would their child. It was a soothing motion, but on this occasion woefully insufficient.
I screwed up, Brad.
Tika finally managed to choke out.
I screwed up so bad.
Bradigen gave her a comforting squeeze. He did not say a word. It was a long while before Tika finally calmed down enough to talk again. Bradigen stayed with her the entire time, keeping her company. Part of her feared that he would make for the assemblage the moment Tika was calmed down, but he didn't go anywhere. He guided Tika to her bedside, gently sat her down. He wrapped her up in a blanket to help her feel secure, warm, and safe. He draped an arm comfortingly around her shoulders. Bradigen finally mumbled after what felt like forever. This is all such a mess. Tika felt a thrill of fear, her head shooting up. Before she could stop herself, she reached out and took hold of the dwarf's lapel.
Please, don't tell the assemblage,
she pleaded, her voice high and hoarse. Bradigen blinked, looking down at her. Tika?
I know it's illegal and I know it's wrong, but Avaline's a good person,
she pleaded, shaking her head in desperation.
She doesn't deserve to be in a cell or whatever it is the Magi do to enchanted people. Please don't turn her in.
Bradigen held up his hands defensively. Whoa, hey, easy, he said placatingly, before reaching out to take hold of Tika's shoulders. He gave a firm squeeze, silencing any further words from the frantic Kraven. I'm not going to turn her in, Tika. Relax. Tika blinked, taken aback. She released her hold on him and backed up a bit, confused.
You're not?
Bradigen shook his head. No, I'm not. There was no lie in his eyes as he let her go. Tika scrunched up her face.
But why not? After everything you said at the lecture and everything you've taught me.
Bradigen winced as if he had been struck. He rubbed at the back of his head and looked away awkwardly. Hey, now, don't get me wrong. Flesh enchantment is not a good thing. A lot of people have been killed by the practice, and in pretty awful ways, too. Some of the worst crimes in our world's history have been committed by flesh enchanters. It's a vile practice. Anyone who performs the operations ought to be locked up, the way I see it, he explained. He looked ahead, his expression hardening into something more thoughtful. But can the same really be said about the people who've been enchanted? He shook his head and leaned forward, lacing his fingers together in his lap. I say, no. Men and women who have been enchanted and live to tell about it are just normal people a lot of the time. Well, you get the occasional rotten apple here or there, sure, but mostly it's just people who had a stroke of bad luck. Either they had no choice, like Avaline said, or they were enchanted against their will. And I find it a waste of time and energy to judge people in that kind of scenario. They deserve our sympathy and our help, not our derision. Plus, removing an enchantment from someone can really hurt them. If it's been there long enough, or if it changes something too much, the body could have become dependent on it.
So if you were to report Avaline,
Tika went on, looking down at the floor as the general implications began to set in. Depending on what her enchantment does, she'd probably be a lot worse off when they were done with her. Bradigen finished with a grim nod. And I'm not about to make that girl's life any harder than it already is. She's a good lass. Tika considered his words for a moment. With that context in mind, her prior outburst became increasingly stupid. Still, she was at least able to smile. She nodded gratefully at her teacher.
Thank you, Brad.
Don't mention it, Bradigen replied with a smile. A moment later, he leaned back and affixed her with a questioning look. Now, I never got to see her runes. You were the one who saw them. Did you take the time to translate them? Figure out what they do? Tika shook her head, embarrassed by the oversight.
No, I didn't. I didn't read the runes. I was too shocked. I covered them up pretty much as soon as I saw them.
Bradigen hummed and they fell silent again. Tika closed her eyes, mentally beating herself up even more. She should have read the runes, or let Bradigen read them, before she replaced the bandages. If she knew what they did, maybe she wouldn't have made such a gigantic fool of herself. She swallowed hard, failing to get rid of the lump in her throat. Her fingers curled into fists in her lap, bunching up the fabric of her skirt.
So, what do we do?
She finally asked, desperate for advice. Bradigen sighed. I dunno, kid. Honestly, I dunno if there's anything we can do. We pretty well pissed her off, he said, defeated. He put his hand on Tika's back. I think right now the best thing we can do is give her some space and hope that she'll be all right. And if she gives you the chance to apologize, you apologize like you've never apologized before. Tika was disappointed, but she couldn't argue. She wanted to track Avaline down and apologize to her right that very second, but she had no idea where to look. And even if she did magically stumble onto Avaline, she doubted the girl would be in any mood to listen to what she had to say. Tika hadn't listened to her, after all. Why ever would Avaline honor her with that privilege? As if triggered by that thought, something happened. A sensation she so despised. A directionless tugging in her chest, and a sudden nervous energy in her feet. A tingling ran along the outer faces of her arms and across her shoulder blades. She shuddered, curling into herself.
No. Not this. Please not this,
she thought. It was the yearning. She hadn't felt it at all for weeks now, and she was just starting to let herself relax and think that it was gone. But now here it was, creeping into her thoughts and her mind, stronger than it had been in years. She shivered, feeling suddenly uncomfortable in her own skin, and the familiar sights and sensations of her own bedroom became alien and disquieting. Bradigen, as if sensing her discomfort, gingerly pulled her into another tight embrace. He said something to her, but the words were an indistinguishable blur in her mind. Still, she leaned into the warmth of his chest, hoping that it would chase the unwanted feelings away. But even this long, familiar embrace now felt out of place, like replacing her favorite soft blanket with a rough, scratchy one. It smelled wrong, it felt wrong against her skin and her feathers. She could only tolerate it for a few seconds, then squirmed out of the embrace. She looked up at Bradigen guiltily. Without a word, she stood up from the bed and let her feet carry her where they willed. Tika? Where are you going? Bradigen called after her. What's wrong? She paused at the door. She didn't look back.
It's the yearning,
she confessed quietly.
I'm going for a walk. I need to think anyway. I'll be back later.
She didn't wait for Bradigen to respond. She stepped out of her bedroom, and in short order, she was slipping out onto the streets of Underbridge. It was mid-afternoon as her feet hit the warm cobbles. She had no destination in mind. She just folded her hands behind her back and walked. She felt the sun on her back mingling with the chilly winds of the high altitude and late season. She closed her eyes whenever there was no one in her way and tried to imagine that she was flying. She pictured enormous feathery wings spreading from her back and carrying her for miles and miles over rolling hills and jagged mountains. She imagined swooping down over the wide-open grasslands around her hometown, acres upon acres of farmland peppered with copses of healthy green trees, all blurring by. It was a beautiful fantasy, but the yearning did not go away. If anything, it became worse. The usually wonderful daydream now only inspired a feeling of profound loneliness. In her mind, she was flying. The sky was hers at last, but it was only hers. No flock to share it with. Her eyes stung again. Tika whipped away the accumulating moisture and pressed on, picking up her pace. Time had little meaning for her as she walked, but she was at least aware of its passing. Bit by bit, the minutes crept by, and the sun began to dip for the horizon. Tika did not stop. She ambled through the familiar back streets and cluttered alleyways she would use as shortcuts when she was little. She walked by Irene's bakery on the street corner, now closed with the imminent setting of the sun. Eventually, she came to a stop. She found a lone lamppost and leaned up against it, giving her legs a rest. Looking up at the pale ring, she noticed the sky growing dark. The blue of daylight was giving way to the reds, pinks, and fading purples of sunset. She realized with detached surprise that she must have been wandering for hours. And still the yearning did not relent. Her beak clacked in frustration.
Just leave me alone, damn you!
She hissed to herself, as if the immovable curse of the Kraven would listen to her of all people. Her words had no effect, as was to be expected. She stayed by that lamp for several minutes, ignoring the concerned faces of the people who passed her by. She could feel the muscles in her legs twitching from the workout she had given them, and she knew she would be regretting this decision come the morning, especially if the aches and pains of an overworked body were combined with the yearning clawing at her mind. The light dimmed more and more as the sun fell, and the background chatter of the city fell gradually into silence, broken only by the occasional scurry of a street rat and the whistle of the wind between the buildings.
I should go home,
Tika thought at last.
Brad's going to be worried. I'm hungry. I'm cold. I'm tired.
There was nothing more she could do out here, and she knew it. She took a deep breath and pushed away from the lamp. The yearning remained as strong as it had ever been, and Tika felt a creeping sense of dread in the bottom of her gut.
Is it going to stay? Is it going to keep bothering me?
She wondered. Her hands came up to fidget nervously over her chest. She was about halfway back to the workshop when, all of a sudden, she came to a stop in the middle of a three-way intersection. She thought she heard something. It was faint, impossibly distant, but it was there. She held perfectly still, listening for it. But all she heard was the wind amidst the buildings, whistling ominously like the cries of a mournful ghost. She was starting to suspect that maybe it was just her imagination, when the winds died down, allowing her to hear the sound again. Unsmothered by other noises, Tika realized with a skip of her heart and a thrill of mixed emotions what it was she was hearing. She turned down the street, her eyes latching onto the barely visible silhouette of her favorite tower. The whistling was coming from there. Avaline's whistling.